Welcome to the Cory Morgan Show. This is my regular opportunity to pick some issues, go into them, dive into them with some interesting guests, and see what kind of interpretations are out there. I've been doing those regular columns online on our Rumble channel and YouTube and such, and of course on the westernstandardonline.com. This is where I talk to some other people rather than just listening to my own voice going on for a while, and we get some great conversations going. To begin with, though, as I always do in these shows, I have to thank the members. This is how this is possible. This is how we get these guests on. We talk about these subjects that other media outlets won't cover. We need those subscribers, and we've got fantastic number of subscribers, and it's been growing. And if you haven't subscribed already, please consider it. Go to the westernstandardonline.com, check it out. You can take out a membership on a trial basis for $10 a month. You get full access to all of our columns, all of our breaking news, our content, and there's a lot of it. We're breaking stories and bringing in new columnists and information all the time. You can try it out free for a couple of weeks. It's well worth your while. I know you're going to stick with it after that. It's good value for your dollar. So for those existing members, thank you. For the ones who haven't joined yet, I invite you to. You won't regret that decision. As well on social media, help us out. Spread the word. If you're following us on Twitter, retweet some of our stuff. If you're on Facebook, make sure to like it, share our stuff, share it on YouTube. This is how we can bypass the old mainstream media ways. They don't want us to talk. The federal government's talking about strangling media, telling us what we can cover, what we can't cover. We're truly independent, but it relies kind of on a two-way thing, this modern way. We need citizens to spread the word with this media as well. So help us out online there, spread that word, and we can keep producing this content for you. So today is a great and interesting subject. We're going to be talking about identity politics, and in particular, victim politics. Everybody's a victim these days. They want to be a victim. They want to be treated differently. They want to be treated specially because they were a victim of this or that, whether it's through race or circumstances or religion or sexual orientation, or the list just goes on and on. Somebody actually took the time and wrote about it, and that somebody is Mark Milke. He's a policy analyst. You've probably seen his name around. He's been involved in a number of groups over the year. He's an author. He's put out a few books. One of my favorites actually was in the past, I remember reading, was Tax Me, I'm Canadian. If you want to see some of the crazy spending that was done, he categorized and listed a whole pile of it in that book. He wrote Nation of Serfs, and now he's written a book called The Victim Cult, and he really breaks down. It's like a cult. It's a trend, and it's a dangerous one, and it's a damaging one. And it took some courage for somebody like him to even write on it, because that's part of it. They cancel and they shut people out from even discussing these issues. And we can't make them better if we can't talk about them. So please hang in here. It's going to be a fascinating conversation and talking to Mark Milke about his latest book, The Victim Cult. All right, well, thank you very much for coming on to join me today, Mark. Your book, I found fascinating and very timely. And the first thing that strikes me is you're having the courage to delve into that. It's sensitive matter that a lot of people can become triggered, I guess, with or upset. So what inspired you to dive into that realm as opposed to some of the books on taxes and such that you did in the past?
Well, probably because I grew up in Kelowna by the West Bank First Nation. And early on, I noticed the difference between successful First Nations and unsuccessful First Nations. And to put not too long a point on it, successful First Nations leaders I found kind of looked forward as opposed to the past. They didn't deny the past, and there's no point in doing that. But the ones that have been successful, and I've done a lot of policy on First Nations over the last 25 years, and I discovered the same thing. So very simply, without being flippant about it, you can acknowledge the past and whatever wrongs happened. What you cannot do, or what you should not do, is focus on the past in a way that sacrifices the future. And ironically enough, 2 years ago, when I was finishing up The Victim Cult, I met Ellis Ross, who you probably know, now running for the BC Liberal leadership, but became famous initially for turning around the Haisla First Nation on the coast of British Columbia. And look, he says, look, our family history has warts as well. But if he and the rest of the Haisla First Nation hadn't looked forward, started to do deals with natural gas companies and so on and so forth, he said they'd still be stuck in poverty. And personally, he'd be stuck in a pretty awful position. And so when I met Ellis Ross 2 years ago and he wrote the foreword for The Victim Cult, or agreed to write the foreword, we were just in simpatico on this, that tragedies happen all the time. There is real victimization in history now. But you better find a way away from that and look forward and figure out how you're going to succeed. So that was really inspiration for the book. First Nations that succeed in Canada and look forward, and those who want to use the past almost as a weapon against the present.
Yeah, I think Chief Louis out of Osoyoos very similarly was very much always on quit being hung up on the past and let's look forward because we have to improve things right now.
Exactly.
And what I appreciated too, so I mean, right now we're seeing it predominantly in people in a position of minority or even an identity where they've turned themselves into a minority. You pointed out some examples where it was people in the majority who were using victimhood, though, as a means to a political ends. I mean, it shows that this trend or this tactic can be harmful. And you went into great depth, for example, as Adolf Hitler played a victim of all people.
Right, of all people. I mean, nothing in the victim cult downplays actual tragedies or gain actual victimization in history or now, right? There's over 7 billion of us on the planet. Even accidentally, tragedies happen, cars smash into each other and that sort of thing. There's no shortage of real tragedies in history or now. But yeah, the most unbelievable part, when you look at sort of, and maybe it's just a human thing, we tend to want to blame others rather than first look, maybe I've contributed to this bad outcome in some way. And so Adolf Hitler, as you mentioned, and the Germans are a good example. I mean, look, my last name is German origin, obviously, but I don't have any sympathy for what happened between really 1800 and 1945. A lot of people are familiar with, for example, how Adolf Hitler used the Versailles Treaty and the claim that Germans were victimized by this post-World War I treaty imposed on them. And Adolf Hitler certainly used that to disrupt Germany and gain power. What people probably don't know, and it's a good historical example, is that Germans actually were victimized. If you go back to the late 18th century, France was occupying part of Germany. And as happens in all wars, there were some pretty vicious things that went on towards the Germans from the French. Now, once the Germans kicked out the French in the early 1800s, the Germans went on some search for, what it means to be a pure German. How do we make Germany great again? Literally, that was the language. And they lapsed into, kind of cultural purity. And to use the language of the present, who's indigenous German and who's not? Like, it was crazy stuff. And long before the Germans became enamored with the very harmful notion of race purity, they got into this notion of cultural purity because they were trying to assert their identity, right? They had been oppressed, they had been victimized by the French, but they made a couple of fundamental errors to think that if you get some sort of pure German culture, pure indigenous culture, that's what it was, that somehow that would save them from, I don't know, future victimization. It wouldn't. It just made them narrow-minded. And so they began to be afraid of everyone, not just Jews in history, which they were, but English, liberals, anybody who wasn't, say, Protestant German of that era. And so the Germans had this notion of victimization early on, and Adolf Hitler picks it up literally a century later, and we know what happened. The subtitle of the victim cult is, how this can wreck civilizations. Well, it wrecked German civilization and turned the land of Germany, which had been Bach and Beethoven, into the land known for Dachau. And of course, German Nazis almost destroyed English civilization. So that's kind of the subtext of the book, that even when you're actually victimized as a person, as a society, as a nation even, you've got to be really, really careful, because if you get stuck there, watch out.
Yeah, and you really go into how being victimized, even if it's genuine and legitimate, doesn't necessarily mean you have to have poorer outcomes later. You went into the example of Asian North Americans, for example, who were treated terribly in the early part of last century. Right. But they've moved beyond that, and they're, as far as a culture or an ethnic group, they're very successful in North America right now.
Right. For those unfamiliar with it, or maybe familiar, the first probably Asian immigrants to Canada and the United States really came around 1850 on the West Coast, in particular California, and shortly after that time to British Columbia. And what I did in the victim cult is I looked at this cohort because they were victimized. They were discriminated against. They were not allowed to vote. They were discriminated against by labor unions, by politicians, and the rest of them. But some interesting things happened over time. They fought back. I would never say just accept your victimization. They fought back in politics and the courts. Sometimes they won, sometimes they didn't. There are great stories of San Francisco and Chicago and New York merchants fighting back, in the courts, and sometimes winning against discriminatory local ordinances that basically tried to outlaw their businesses. And they won sometimes. But the interesting thing is they also took a very proud position in the best sense of that word. They refused to be permanent victims. So, for example, they also, fought back consciously, unconsciously. There was a real emphasis on entrepreneurship and education. So, to give you an example, In 1910 in the United States, they found some terrific statistics where they showed attendance at high schools and universities. So in 1910, white Americans were attending high school, graduating from college at rates higher than Chinese and Japanese Americans. By 1920, 1930, it's actually Chinese and Japanese origin kids in the United States who are graduating from high school and college at a rate much higher than white Americans. Now, what does this do? Well, this sets the groundwork for the future success. But the irony, or the oddity of this is happening at a time in American history and Canadian history that is the most discriminatory period against those of Asian origin, and yet they refuse to permanently see themselves as victims. I should say, by the way, I don't dismiss again the tragedies of history or just kind of take a get over it approach in the victim cult. Japanese Americans and Japanese Canadians were put into internment camps, as almost everybody knows. They deserve compensation for their private property. They only received partial compensation after the war. But there's a big difference between, say, that, where you've been victimized 5 years ago or 20 years ago, and looking back maybe 100 years or 1,000 years. Because there is some, I mean, we're conservatives. We believe in private property. There is something to compensation for when governments do something wrong to you. But it's an art, not a science, and you can't, extrapolate back 1,000 years and say your tribe hit my tribe, therefore that's the reason I am the way I am today. That's stretching it, to put it mildly.
Yeah, one of your statements from the book was everyone's ancestor was a victim. If we go far enough back, everybody could find something, but there's no sense hanging up on it. I mean, we can acknowledge it without using it as a crutch or an excuse for not doing well today. Another denominator you spoke on in there was strong family units. I mean, people, cultures, groups that tended to prosper, that tended to be stable and did well, tended to have united families. And that's been touched upon in a number of other books. But it's one of those things, how could you change that trend? Because broken families are actually starting to become endemic in every culture right now.
Yeah, and that's a tough one. In one sense, I don't have a Tony Robbins 1, 2, 3 approach to how to solve these problems. I think that would be flippant. What I try and do in the victim cult, though, is what I try and do is disprove some of the commonly held assumptions for why outcomes for certain groups are the way they are. So, for example, in the victim cult, I look at Black Americans and I do some extra research, but I also quote Thomas Sowell, the famous economist who happens to be Black, incidentally, but he grew up in the South and in Harlem. And he's come across this argument, and you still hear it today in the wake of Black Lives Matter and the rest of it, that everything is due to racism. Every outcome, every disparity between, say, white Americans, Black Americans is due to racism. No, it's not. As Thomas Sowell points out, and I quote him in The Victim Cult, if you look at, for example, the notion, for example, that broken apart Black American families vis-a-vis the other Americans, the higher preponderance of that is due to slavery or due to racism. And Thomas Sowell says, no, Black American families were pretty together until the 1950s, until, in his view, the welfare state began to incentivize them to break apart. And the same thing with education. He looks at a couple of Washington, D.C. schools who two of the three were Black in Washington, D.C., and they regularly beat the white schools in standardized tests. Now, this declines by the 1950s, but between the 1880s and the 1950s, before Black Americans get their deserved civil rights enforced, Black American children are doing better in these Washington, D.C. schools, and it's only the result of a falling educational, or a new education reform that really screws up the education system that hurts Black American children in Washington, D.C. So you can't blame what happened on racism. You can blame it on really weird educational theories that started to appear in the 1950s.
Yeah, well, we're getting into some strange times. I remember a few years ago, there was a Toronto school celebrating having a Black-only school. I would only think that Martin Luther King must have been turning over in his grave. I mean, with all the sacrifice we had to do for integration, and now we're moving back into separating from each other.
Right. It's really dangerous. And again, it's this notion of cultural purity. And people today, I don't think, know their history, and they don't know the danger of this. So in the victim cult, as we talked about a moment ago, Germans thought the best way to recover from the harmful effects of the French occupation was to restore a true German culture. And again, they defined it very narrowly. No Jews. If you're in Northern Germany, no Roman Catholics. They didn't like the English. They didn't like liberalism. They basically didn't like anybody who wasn't German. But you see this notion of cultural purity in Rwanda by the majority Hutu starting in 1960. Most of your viewers probably know that there was a massacre, the genocide in 1994. Well, What predated that was 30 years of the majority population in Rwanda, the Hutus, blaming everything on the minority Tutsis. And again, talking about cultural purity and literally using the words indigenous. We're indigenous, Hutus. You Tutsi are not, and you are to blame for our problems. This was promulgated through state propaganda in the education system. The Tutsis were made to feel inferior, that somehow they didn't belong there, and that if they ever stepped out of line, there was pogroms almost from the beginning of independence. And this went on for decades until basically a spark lit in 1994, and you had 1 million Tutsis and others, minorities killed, murdered. So it's very dangerous to go down this road, even in a liberal democracy, of I think the comedian Bill Maher talked about how do we get back to separate but equal nonsense, right? And you see that again but something being a pure anything isn't going to save you. What changes, what helps people succeed is actually copying the best from other cultures, right? I mean, the Europeans stole Arab numbers from, the Arabs. Arab culture stole it from, India. And if we had all been stuck with Roman numerals, I mean, there's a lot of stuff we wouldn't be able to do today, like basic calculations. I mean, so cultural boring and sharing is a good thing. And people who think they should retreat into kind of a perfectionist or pure silo, that's actually regressive. And it doesn't matter what your excuse for that is. And it forgets shared humanity. Let me put it a different way. It also misreads the human heart. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the famous Soviet dissident, who I quote in The Victim Cult, in his book, The Gulag Archipelago, said it's really tempting to think that the problem is over there, that person over there. If only we get rid of them or their tribe, then all will be well. And Solzhenitsyn said, no, that's not what's happening here. He said the dividing line between good and evil runs through every human heart. And that's the problem, is we're losing the sense of shared humanity today. So just as liberalism, the best parts of liberalism, the Martin Luther King parts, judge people by the content of their character, not their skin color. Just as we finally get to that in Western society, all of a sudden you've got people who make wrong cause and effect links and want to blame some problem not on an education system or family breakdown or geography. Instead, they want to blame it on racism, and they use as an excuse to retreat into a silo and say, if only we can have pure culture. Pure culture doesn't give you an engineering degree. It doesn't give you an education. It doesn't give you a career. It just has the potential to make you bitter. So that's the danger with the pure culture argument.
Yeah, well, and as I said, it's a very timely book. Identity politics have really been dominating our actions lately. I think, it's a broader subject perhaps on how social media has actually allowed us to separate from each other and cluster in groups rather than integrate and share those positive aspects, as you said. So just in closing, I mean, there's just so much to unpack in that book. Where can we find more information about yourself, your past books, and of course, this current one, The Victim Cult?
Sure. Go to thevictimcult.com or markmilke.com. Book is available in your local bookstores, Chapters, Amazon, across Canada, across the United States as well.
Great. Well, thank you very much for coming on and unpacking a little bit of that for me. I mean, again, it's just been a fascinating book, and hopefully we can start studying and realizing that we're just not going down a good path. As you said, cultural purity. I mean, some people perhaps pursuing it thinking that they're on a road to something good, but that it tends to be negative historically.
It's a destructive idea. And again, I think the best counterexample of that are Asian, those of Asian origin in Canada and the United States, who early on, you read their stories, they wanted to be integrated into the mainstream. They also wanted to change the mainstream, and they did. They made America and Canada better, when white Canadians and white Americans were in a pretty racist period, 100 years ago. But they made Canada and America better by their contribution, but they wanted to contribute. I mean, one of the stories I have in The Victim Cult is of a Japanese union leader who's saying to the American Federation of Labor, let us in, we want to be part of you. And they're saying, no, stay away. So again, it's ironic today that some groups, leaders of some groups, I don't think it's the majority of any ethnic group, any racial identity, but it's ironic today and tragic that some leaders of some, self-appointed, collectives think that the best way to deal with, I don't know, even personal prejudice you may encounter today is retreating into a silo and into some sort of fake purity. I mean, look, Japan did that for 300 years, and then they had to be opened up by the Americans, or they were at a disadvantage. Cultural purity puts you at a disadvantage. Integration and sharing cultural successes and economic successes is the way, frankly, for everyone to move forward.
Well, that's great. And we'll leave off on that note of something to strive for as a community with a number of cultures contributing.
Thank you, Cory.
Thank you.